Good morning. Hello, hello, hello. TinaO here from Powerhouse Impact Media Group. It is Wednesday, which means we have just completed a live gather for her session, a co-created conversation with changemakers. And we were on with Miah Olmsted this morning. We spent an hour with her listening to her, um, I want to say like invitation, picture painting, um, storytelling, welcoming, drawing in of us about data and storytelling, and so much more. I'm going to give you a couple of highlights that, of course, come from my lens, and but you will have yours. And so, with that, I invite you to watch the full episode here on this page. You'll find it. It's the gather anyway. It just happened, so it's easy to find. You'll also be able to find it on our podcast when that goes live. Usually, the podcast goes up about the following season because we're finishing the current season right now. So there's lots of ways that you can listen to it. But these are some of the pieces that really showed up for me. And I think the first thing was, even though I know this in the house, because the Powerhouse is a house of leaders for global impact, and everything we do as a bridge organization from Indigenous and non-Indigenous, comes through an Indigenous lens. Or you might even say, depending on what part of the world you're in, you might just call it through the lens of the earth, through the lens of our connection to First Peoples, through the lens of the wisdom that comes when we listen, when we remember that we are part of, when we remember that leaf is all our relations. So I say that because of course, our show, Gather for Her, comes from Turtle Island. And so when we say Indigenous, we're speaking to the Indigenous piece from Turtle Island, but you may be watching from Africa or from Australia, and Indigenous for you may have different cultural symbols. And yet, where we all seem to intersect is this understanding of our Indigenous creation, where we are all from as one family. And so, our conversation today with Miah, with Impact Arts Co-op, which has a very global, it has a global reach. The word Indigenous, I really felt the fire of the global conversation with Miah today. I think we had a listener from Nigeria that is part of Impact Arts as well. So there was a presence in the conversation that had, I don't know, I just want to say the reminder for me anyway, the reminder of the one family of all of us. Our edge of the wedge, if you will, our way into the conversation was talking to Miah about being a data storyteller. And she said this thing about counting and about measuring and about curiosity, and how data is the stuff that we actually talk about. That we're not only are we data driven with our phones and our numbers and all of that kind of stuff, that's data, but we're data in our symbols. We're data in our passing of information. And when we retell a story, we're telling the data of what happened. And it's the data of what happened that gets passed on and passed on and passed on. Now, the emotionality, and we often think about storytelling like the zone that storytelling creates, which is the connective tissue, and that came up in our conversation too, the connective tissue that storytelling creates. But we were coming from this conversation about what happens in the story, and why do those happenings matter, and how do we ensure that all of the data, however we can do that, but in an oral tradition, but that all of the data stays in the story. We also kind of brushed up against or walked into a more intangible conversation around cultural appropriation, around and misappropriation, although we didn't go into misappropriation. But if you're going to talk about appropriation, then misappropriation, your brain just goes, what's the opposite of that? And there was this piece that came up about when you're building a house. And I love this part of Miah's bit. It's my favorite part, actually, of the talk today, of our conversation with Miah, was when she was talking about when you're building a house and you're building it for people to live in it, whether you're living in it, whether you're living in it for a bowl of soup, whether you're living in it for 3 months of care, whether you're living in it for your entire lifetime, whether you're living in it as a point of connection, a handshake, an elbow touch, however you are living in it, when you build a house for people to live in it or for all creation to live in it, you consult all who will live there. And that was that piece of around inclusivity and community and the data that's required to do that. I encourage you to listen to the conversation with Miah because storytelling does have this a bigness to it that can keep us from connecting because it feels too big. But when Miah goes there, she takes us into the micro. She takes us into the micro of the story so that the macro has a different context. I'm a context junkie. I am such a macro context person. So for me, it was almost like shaking my head a bit and having to come in rather than go out. But where we were going with this is by coming in, we actually get out. There was another piece that came up about the importance of weaving and the organization of Powerhouse Impact Media Group with Miah's Impact Arts Co-op, with Sharon's Diva Staffing Solutions, and how Diva and Impact Arts and Powerhouse are weaving together in this one family way. And not as we use the term braiding a lot because it helps, I think, our colonial mindsets to see how individuation can work as a collective. But when you talk to Miah, I don't see the braids. I don't see the individuation. I see the wholeness. And so that also came up in conversation. So I really invite you to dig into it and see where it takes you and what are the new thoughts that come up for you? Because certainly for me, every time I talk to Miah, I feel like my brain kind of just has to stretch a little bit because there's language that she uses. And I don't mean words, I mean like language that she uses that is not embodied in my thinking. And so it's like it takes a little bit to go, oh, I get where we are. Oh, I know where we are. And then my language expands. And my relatability then expands, and my weaving becomes less individuated and more whole. So come on in to our conversation today, have a listen, and know that next week we'll be joining in a wisdom circle to unpack all of these things that happened in the conversation. So, but that doesn't happen live on Facebook or on LinkedIn. The wisdom circle happens on Zoom, and it's a private conversation. Private because it's just not a public one. That's all. It's just not public. It's like we're unpacking and we're digging and we want you there. So if you want to be part of the Wisdom Circle, join us at powerhouse.com. Go to gather and go to registration, and you'll be sure to get all of our emails about upcoming Wisdom Circles and the upcoming next Powerhouse conversation, gather conversation. Thanks for being here. I'm TinaO. I represent in the braid of us in Powerhouse, the listener. I work in myth. I work in story. Often I work with artists of impact. So when you listen to me, you're going to get all of that kind of goopy stuff. Yeah, can't wait to meet you. See you in the house.